Hey there, this is Quadrant with another tutorial for my friends at pluginboutique.com. I'm going to try something different with this tutorial. Rather than looking at one plugin or even one type of plugin, we're going to be looking at a finished sound and talking about several layers of processing that go into achieving that final product. So one of the reasons that modern electronic music production is so hard to master is that so many of its sounds can only be achieved through the use of multiple effects. So when you're trying out a distortion plugin or a filter plugin, it's sometimes hard to get a clear idea of how it fits into the bigger picture. What ends up happening in practice is that processing chains exhibit a kind of synergy, which means that the whole ends up being greater than the sum of its parts. So to really drive this point home, I've made a demo song and spent a fair amount of time dialing in the bass. So let me play the whole thing for you in context. Alright, so let's dig into what makes this sound tick. You'll notice that apart from the synth, there are 7 plugins stacked on it. There are actually even more, which I'll get into in a second. But this is pretty typical for these types of sounds in drum and bass. So we'll start by soloing the bass. And we're going to strip the whole thing back to just the synth. Alright, so we're starting out with a pretty simple tone and operator. Operator is a great synth that's included with Ableton Suite, and it lets you do FM and additive synthesis. So the synth we've got here sounds like a pure sine wave, but it actually has a very slight third harmonic poking through, which you can see here in the spectrum analyzer. See, right there, third harmonic. And that's worth pointing out because listen to the difference in the finished sound when I mute oscillator B and take that third harmonic away. So you notice how without that third harmonic to grab onto, a lot of the filter sweeps end up sounding kind of toothless. And that's a theme you're going to see a lot, that small differences earlier in the signal path end up making a huge difference later on. So with that in mind, let's enable the first plugin and see what that sounds like. And once again without it. So the first stop here is a plugin from F-Expansion called Mall, and Mall's a super versatile distortion plugin that lets you pick from a wide variety of different overdrive, distortion, and wave shaping algorithms. So here you'll notice that I've got it in serial mode, which means that each of the distortion modules right here are processing the full bandwidth signal, and they're feeding their output into the next module in the chain. So this one goes into this one, goes into this one. I only have the middle unit's distortion activated here with the germanium diode algorithm, but both the left and right module are still providing a little bit of saturation and tone shaping. And you'll notice that when Mall is active, 2 things happen. A, the signal gets way louder, and also these additional harmonics add some richness to the sound. So next up, I'll enable the second plugin in the chain. And this is actually an audio effects rack in Live where I've split the signal so I can apply distortion without muddying up the low end. And the plugin here I'm using is called Bias Desktop from Positive Grid. Let's bring that up. And it's actually a guitar amp and effects modeling plugin. So it turns out that a lot of effects originally built for guitar sound really good on synths too, and this one's no exception. We'll listen to the before and after. We audition Bias Desktop. So see how it really brings out a lot of that top end fuzz, and it makes it sound a lot more interesting. So a little bit more about Bias Desktop. Since I've been playing around with it for a little while, it's really impressed me with its flexibility and its sound quality. You'll notice up at the top here how it models various components in the signal path of a typical guitar amp setup. It allows you to do really cool things like changing the modeled tube type for the preamp section and for the power amp section as well. There's also a transformer section which lets you choose from different modeled transformers. There are 2 EQs you can patch into the signal path, and there's also a huge variety of cabinet models. And if that's a bit complex, it also provides a ton of presets that cover all types of amp styles and playing styles. So before we move on, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on why I'm using this effects rack. So I've split the signal up into 2 parallel chains, and I'm sending one of them to Bias Desktop, right here. And the full frequency signal is being distorted, but then I'm putting a high pass filter right after it, so only the high end's actually making it through. And then there's a dry chain that's being passed through unaltered, which you can hear, when you solo. So put them both together and you get that nice defined top end, but you avoid getting that distorted mud in the bass that you'd otherwise get if you didn't put this high pass filter here. All right, so moving on, let's look at the next important part of the signal path, and that's the filter. So I'm using another F-Expansion plugin here called Etch, and if I expand this, you'll see I've got another parallel chain going on. Most of the magic is happening in this top chain with Etch, so let's check that out first. Etch is a multimode filter that includes 2 separate filters. You can run them in either series or in parallel. It's got some great sounding distortion and a compressor and some pretty crazy modulation capabilities as well. So in this instance, I've got a fatty bandpass filter with a pretty high amount of resonance on filter 1 and a Japan 4-pole low-pass filter on filter 2. And they're running in parallel, so the signal from one isn't affecting the other, but I do have the cutoff frequencies linked. You can see that here. So that means that when I move the cutoff knob on filter 1, it's simultaneously going to change the frequency on filter 2. So I chose a bandpass filter because it's a great way to get really squelchy filter sweeps from harmonically rich sounds like the one we're feeding into it. And I supplemented it with this low-pass filter so I could let a little bit more of the low end peek through. The cutoff was automated on the live timeline. You can see that right here. And I just drew in some breakpoints and started playing around until things sounded good. So let's look at the rest of the chains on this effects rack. Not going to go into too much detail here, but these are basically here to accentuate the sub and the highs a little bit. So I've got a compressor here, and that's actually sidechained to the signal that's coming out of Etch. And what that does is it pulls back the volume on the dry signal when Etch is at its loudest, rather. So basically, when the bandpass frequency goes up, a little bit more of the dry sub comes through. When it goes down, a little bit more of the unaffected high end comes through. So when I solo, you can't really hear a whole lot on their own. You can hear it a lot better if I take these out and then add them back into the filtered signal. Especially that top end one. So that's important because even though it's really subtle, it gives a little bit more movement to the high end, and the later processing is going to be able to grab onto that and work with it. So next in the signal path, we've got another instance of Mall. And as you can see here, I'm using it in multiband mode, which means that each of these distortion modules is working on a separate frequency band. So I'm doing this to add just a little bit of grit to the upper mid-range of the sound, which you can hear really clearly when I bring this effect in and out. You can hear how it takes the sound from being more of a kind of synthetic sound, gives it more of kind of a raspy growl. And once again, that effect is being applied to the top end of the sound while letting the dry signal through unaffected. So just that, we'll add it to this. Super useful technique. So next in the signal chain, you've actually got another instance of Bias Desktop, and it's got the same configuration as before, dry and then distortion with some high pass. Let's take a look at that and hear what it sounds like. And this is just the super bass preset that I've tweaked a little bit. And notice it adds more grit, but it also adds some dimension to the sound, which is really a testament to how good the speaker cab emulation is on this software. I found that a lot of amp emulation software tends to make things sound like they're coming from inside a tin can, but you can get some really nice results with the different speaker models and placements in this plugin, as well as a couple of different mic models. So I'm going to do a quick diversion here to show you what happens. So we've got two instances of Bias Desktop here, and let's hear what it sounds like when we disable one or the other. So notice how when we remove this layer of Bias Desktop, the first instance of it, the whole top end just disappears. And as we saw, the same goes for the second instance of Bias as well. And you can also play around with, different plugins in the signal chain to see what it's going to do if you turn other ones off. Which really gets to the main point of this video, that chaining processors together like this really does have a synergistic effect that you can't replicate with just one of the elements alone. And sometimes it's tough to tell ahead of time which combinations are going to work well and which ones aren't. So I'd encourage you to always experiment with stacking and reordering your effects, because even if you've had a plugin for years and you think you've heard everything it can do, putting it in a new context can really create some surprising and fun new sounds. So, moving on to the last, second to last one in our chain here, we've got some chorus on the top end, courtesy of Togu Audio Line. And this is a great chorus you can pick up for free at pluginboutique.com, and it's just adding some nice dimension and stereo width. And I've also turned up the volume on it slightly, so it's acting a little bit like a shelving EQ for the top end, since I'm using the high pass here and only letting the top end through. And then lastly, we've got a simple EQ at about 280 hertz. That's just the built-in live EQ, bringing it down 5 dB. And that's just to scoop out a little bit of the low mid-range that was getting a bit muddy with all those filter sweeps. So here's without. And here's with. Just a little bit cleaner. And to recap, this is the original sound, and this is it with all the processing. So that's all the time I've got today. All the plugins I covered in this tutorial are available from pluginboutique.com. It was Mall and Etch from Fxpansion, Bias Desktop from Positive Grid, and the Tall Chorus LX from Togu Audio Line. And as a bonus, if you have these plugins and you'd like to dig into how the sound was put together, there's a link at the end of the video where you can download this Ableton project. Once again, I'm Quadrant. Thanks for watching.